Plain Truth, the show where we try to get into some of the mysteries, anomalies, and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Paul, and joining us this week, we have David Livingstone. David, are you there?
I'm here. Hi, how are you?
Oh, fine. Thanks for coming. And along for the ride, my friend Jerry. Jerry, are you there?
Hi, guys. Welcome back, David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you.
Well, David is one of those researchers into the unusual, the esoteric, the mysteries, the hidden stuff from the centuries and millennia past, particularly the things like, let's say, the Muslim Brotherhood or, whatever they came from hundreds of years ago. And he's got an interesting book called Black Terror, White Soldiers. Is that the title?
Yeah, that's right.
And you got a website on Illuminati terrorism. I like that title. People can just search your name, and then they'll find all these things. But David, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm an independent researcher. I went to university for a few years, about 25 years ago. But I actually quit as a form of personal political protest. I was more of a hot-headed youngster back then. Mm-hmm. And after I discovered that the university system was basically what I call a system of higher indoctrination, not higher education, I decided that I was going to not have anything to do with it. And but fortunately, what I learned at the time was enough to basically give me the few clues that I've been following ever since. So yeah, it's been very beneficial in that sense, and so I've been studying these threads for the last almost 25 years now.
Well, it takes most of us decades to recover from going to university.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to unlearn all the lies, propaganda, spin, and so on. Right.
Exactly.
So I can totally relate to that. Well, David, there's so much going on in the world today. The Middle East is just getting hotter and hotter, and then, for that matter, what can you say? The struggle between what appears to be the Western financial oligarchical types, like the City of London and Wall Street, versus Russia and the BRICS countries. So it looks like we're on the verge of, grand struggles. I don't know. Have you got any thoughts on that?
I don't want to sound a little too pessimistic, but one way or the other, I think we're headed for what's planned as World War III. Maybe not necessarily going to happen that way, but they are preparations, at least preliminary preparations for something of that sort. So I really think this all goes back to the Clash of Civilizations, which was articulated by the neoconservatives, going all the way back to the early 90s. And and the clean break strategy, which was written by Netanyahu and Richard Perle, among others. And it's a new Cold War, of course. So, and also I think somehow I believe the Albert Pike scenario, if you're familiar with that one, of the three world wars.
Sure, Mazzini and all that, the Third World War in the Middle East.
The Zionists against the Muslims, I believe.
Yeah, so this was actually, there's some confusion about this because this was reported by William Guy Carr, who wrote Pawns in the Game. And he wrote that back in 1954. I think Carr's book is a modern-day classic, a conspiracy researcher's classic. But it's very poorly written in the sense that there's very, very few footnotes. So there's no reference to many of his claims. And what happens is that in that particular portion of the book, he refers to a letter between Pike and Mazzini, which was supposedly in the library of, what's it called? The library, what's it called? A major library.
British National Museum, I think.
The British National Museum. And so this has caused some confusion. There's Terry Melanson of Conspiracy Archive who investigated this. He recognized that this is a part of a confusion. And basically Carr's poor research in a sense, which led to that incorrect association. But what it really was is that there's a portion in that page where Carr is talking about unleashing the nihilists. And that's the portion that he was claiming incorrectly that was found in the British Library. But the other portion where he's talking about the Three-World War scenario, he's actually paraphrasing something. It doesn't say where he got it. But the amazing thing is that, you know, whether it's true or not, that's obviously one way or the other exactly what's happening. And I find that for Carr to be able to say that back in 1954, you know, it's hard to convince people of that now, you know, let alone whatever is 40, 50 years ago, right? So obviously he had a great insight into how things were going to shape up, or maybe possibly he had an authentic source that he was referring to. So clearly, pardon?
I was just going to say that's almost reminiscent of the protocols, right? Because, you know, it's claimed to be a forgery, but if it is a forgery, it's a pretty prophetic one, right?
Exactly. So, which is interesting because I have a chapter on my book on the protocols of Zion, and it's there's some really surprising associations involved in the revelation of the protocols. And although I believe a significant portion of it is true, obviously I think there was a revelation of the method going on there because there's just too many suspicious characters involved in its exposure.
That makes sense. Hey, David, if it's a forgery, then what's the original?
You know, I think maybe it was kind of like a whitewash version or something like that, because it's especially interesting when you know, one person who has been ascribed to is Theodor Herzl, of course, right? From the Zionist conference in Basel, which was, what was it, 1895 or something around there. So Theodor Herzl, there's a great documentary for anybody who's interested called Herzl and Zionism, and it's a documentary produced by a couple of Israeli documentary filmmakers, and it's fascinating. They basically find several quotes in Herzl's diaries where he admits, in his own words, that he recognized that to pursue the Zionist cause, that it was going to be necessary to promote anti-Semitism. And what I believe is from the research that I found is that I think that the Zionists were almost entirely responsible for the creation of Zion or anti-Semitism over the last 150 years or so, particularly the pogroms of the late 19th century. Am I saying that right? Late 19th century, and then of course leading on right up to the Nazis. So because you know the paradox, the difficulty is that the Jews have had a very challenging time particularly in European societies, going back almost 2,000 years, right? You know, first of all, they were often involved in types of trade which were very controversial, particularly, first of all, the slave trade, which was what they dominated in the early Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, and then, of course, as money changers. And so what happened is that through many of these centuries, in many societies, Jews began to be seen as a very problematic community, a minority community. So what happens is that they're actually kicked out of many, basically most of the countries of Europe from around the 12th century to the 15th or 16th century. And so there's always this difficulty of dealing with the sort of antisocial behavior that is somehow, I guess, sanctioned, to an extent by the Jewish community, because you know there's certain laws in the Bible and even the Talmud that allow Jews to behave one way towards themselves and another way towards others. So this is great, but you know this is a particular European problem specifically because these are situations that didn't exist, for example, in the Middle East, where Jews basically flourished. You have the example of the Jewish community in Moorish Spain, which I think it's the 10th century, is considered the golden age of Judaism. Like, that's the extent. And you have this. There's a recent book on it called "The Ornament of the World," which describes the period. It's a fascinating period, and it's a great example of how numerous religious communities can basically cohabitate, not necessarily collaborate, but at least accommodate each other and flourish independently. So we have the European example, which is a little bit different. And so I think what's happening today is that people are recognizing the basically antisocial tendencies of the Jewish community, but the problem is that they associate that with the entire Jewish population and specifically with the conspiracy. So, and I think that this is what the Zionists have aimed at specifically. And this is pretty much what Theodor Herzl said. He basically said, I can't remember exactly what the words were, but he said, you look at, the Jewish money and Jewish monopoly, Jewish control, and everywhere, it's a threat and a menace. So all we have to do is point the finger to it, and we'll create the sentiments that will assist us in our cause. So, we have this reality of this tendency in the Jewish community to be basically disruptive, but people not being able to distinguish independent action from the conspiracy. But this, as I said, this is precisely what they want, and it's precisely what they've created. And this brings us back to the problem today, because this is what they're trying to create. So if we go back to Albert Pike's Third World War scenario, they want to create the World War III is a conflict between Zionism and the Islamic world. Now, if we understand the conspiracy is basically Zionist. But I'm not sure at what level they see themselves at, but I believe that they are intending to use some level of Zionism against the Islamic fundamentalism that they've created. So this is where you see a lot of the anti-Semitism. This is how basically anti-Semitism has been their tool, and it's been their tool through, as I said, the pogroms, the Nazis, particularly in the United States with the Christian right, the Christian identity movement, the Aryan nations, right on up through the Tea Party and groups like that. Then, of course, in the Middle East with the Muslim Brotherhood and so on and so forth, where they are creating this association of where they can, because this is basically what the Jews did. Like Hitler did, use the protocols to blame the actions of a tiny, powerful minority on the entire population. And what happens is that he sends the trains and the trucks into the ghettos to pick up the shopkeepers, the street sweepers, and so on and so forth, to send them into concentration camps, while the same people who are supposedly behind the writing or the dictation of the protocols are the same people who are financing him into power.
Well, David, this is always the story. I mean, what's going on today in the Ukraine. Not that long ago, a huge thing was the fire pogrom in Odessa, where the Russian sentiment people, maybe 150, were burnt, gassed, raped, various other things, in just about the most atrocious way we've seen in Europe since World War II. Right? Just unbelievably grim what happened. And it looks like that was funded by the Jewish oligarch Kolomoisky.
Right.
And, there are actually leaked letters and phone calls of like Jewish leaders saying, oh, my God, this is going to put us in a terrible situation. Yeah. Right. Odessa used to be famous as a very Jewish city. I mean, a lot of them have left and moved to Israel or whatever with the fall of communism. But nonetheless, you're sitting there saying, the richest, most powerful Jew in the country was behind this. And by the way, it made no sense in normal logic. You know what I mean? It was right. Burning alive 150 people or gassing them or whatever. What good does it do? It's just an act of terrorism to make everyone hate the people involved.
Yeah.
And so some of this stuff is as old as the hills, right? It just seems like it comes back every 50 years or something. It seems like haven't we seen this script before?
Well, I think it's Illuminati plot, so it's actually more specifically about 250 years old, and then depending on how far I think you could trace it back to Sabbatai Zevi, 1666. I think an important point is that the problem is when people think of Jews, they think of the Jews as a race now, and that's a modern manifestation. Judaism is a religion, and it's always been anybody can convert and become a Jew. So the reality is, until very recently, Judaism was regarded as a religion. It's only through the influence of Sabbatianism that Judaism has come now to be seen as a race, because it's very much part of their corruptive influence on the Jewish community. So now when we think of Jews, we think of them as a unified people. We think of them as a block, as a community. Whereas if you look at Christians or if you look at Muslims, you recognize that they have a proliferation of sects, right? We know that the Muslims at least are divided between Sunni and Shia, but then even then there's beyond them, there's Wahhabis, Salafis, Barelvis, Tablighis, Ismailis, on and on and on and on. So we just immediately assume that, the Muslim community is divided. So if you see the actions of the Wahhabis, we're not surprised to see a war between Muslims and Shia, because we recognize that there's a conflict. Same thing with Christianity. We're not surprised if, we've heard of wars between Catholics and Protestants in the past. But we don't look at the Jewish community that way. And the Jewish community is not this unified whole because of this perception that we have of them today as being a race.
That actually leads into something I was going to ask you about.
Yeah.
A lot of people say now that there is a schism within Judaism, that there's sort of the neocon right, or the religious kind of crazy right, versus the neoliberal sort of atheistic left, and they're kind of at odds with one another. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I really think the secret goes back to for me, the solution was offered by Rabbi Antelman, who wrote To Eliminate the Opiate. And this is really the clue to help us understand what's going on. And most of these modern trends are actually products of Sabbatian influence, because we don't realize to what degree the Sabbatians have basically hijacked the Jewish community. So as I said, we talked about Judaism really being a religion, and even being regarded by Jews as a religion. You could be excommunicated from Judaism, right? Which is not something we can understand today. You're not going to be excommunicated from Israel, right? So basically, you have the advent of Sabbatai Zevi in 1666, and you have the beginning of this sect, a sect which evolved into being an anti-Jewish sect. And this is why, basically, just how you could have a conflict or even war between Sunnis and Shia, you can have war and persecution take place between Sabbatians and other Jews. So it's a divided community on a religious basis. So
I think they would you say the Sabbateans were sort of the driving force behind Zionism? Because I know Herzl, when he first started, he was actually going to try and convert the entire Jewish religion over to Christianity, I think, at one point, right?
It could be, which would be, that would be a Frankist tactic, right?
Right.
So, but yes, I mean, the entire development of Judaism and the Jewish community over the last 150 years, from what I understand, has been largely influenced through the Sabbatian movement. So that really begins in the middle of the 1800s with Moses Mendelssohn. Well, first of all, I mean, it goes all the way back, of course, to the founding of the Illuminati, which was funded by the Rothschilds, who, according to Rantelman, were secretly Sabbatians. But then if you go a couple of years later, this is something else which is fascinating that Rantelman reveals, is that there's a list of ordination that lists the successors of Sabbatai Zevi. And there's another of them, there's a very famous Rabbi Eberschutz, who was involved in what's called the Eberschutz controversy and so on and so forth. Anyway, basically I'm mentioning that because that's to refer to the very controversial the history of the Sabbatians and how much conflict they actually had to undergo with the Jewish community, that they were heavily persecuted by the rest of the community, who often tried to excommunicate them. They often had these various controversies with debates of, against their doctrines and so on and so forth. So in the first, prior to the 1800s, the Sabbatians were not accepted. They had to operate in secret. If ever they were suspected, if ever a Jew was suspected of being a Sabbatian, he usually had to be brought forward, persecuted, excommunicated, and so on and so forth. But what happens is that with the rising influence, I guess probably through Rothschild financing, they began to start to take hold and exercise greater and greater influence. So as I said, one of the important leaders listed, successors of Sabbatai Zevi listed in this list of ordination, was Moses Mendelssohn, who was one of the most influential people of the period, highly connected with various members of the Illuminati. And he basically is the founder of what is considered secular Judaism. So, prior to this, Jewish communities tended to live in ghettos, tended to be Jewish, to follow Jewish traditions, follow Bible traditions. But the secular Jews attempted to find a new way of operating within European society, basically by choosing instead to assimilate. So instead of living in ghettos, instead of openly following Jewish tradition, they would get a normal university education, a career, involve themselves, basically blend into the community, blend into the rest of the community. So this was an entirely new strategy. So we have to understand that this kind of approach is Sabbatian in the sense because it's an atheistic approach.
Can I ask a question, David? Is there any actual evidence that links the Rothschilds to the founding of the Illuminati? I mean, I've heard different theories. I've heard Adam Weishaupt was actually a converted Jew who converted and went into the Jesuits before founding the Illuminati. I don't know if that's accurate or not. But is there any paper trail or any monetary trail that we can sort of trace back to the Rothschilds?
Well, I'll tell you, to be honest, it's pretty tenuous. But there is some indirect evidence, at least. The Rothschilds started at the House of Hessen-Kassel. And there were three principal members there. There was the father, Frederick, and Karl. And basically it's with this family, by becoming the official lenders to this family, that this Rothschild built up their fortune. So Karl of Hessen-Kassel actually becomes the Grand Master of the Asiatic Brethren. And the Asiatic Brethren were, according to Albert Pike, the successors of the Illuminati. The Asiatic Brethren were founded by Moses Dobruschka, who was the cousin of Jacob Frank, who was the successor to Sabbatai Zevi. So, as to direct evidence of them founding the founding the Illuminati, as far as I know, I don't know of any, but,
some good circumstantial evidence.
It's pretty powerful circumstantial evidence, and just the fact of, their proximity to Frankfurt and Offenbach, which was Frank's stronghold, and so on and so forth. I think it's pretty clear. So, this is a conspiracy, so. And in some cases, the evidence is always going to be a little tenuous.
Well, I've got a couple of questions since we're on the Rothschilds here. It seems most unlikely to me that you can go from being a goldsmith or something to being the richest family in Europe in 50 years. Right. If you look at the world today, is that imaginable? Can a talented family go from nowhere to trillionaires in 50 years or something? So it kind of raises the question as to who they're fronting for. The Knights Templar, perhaps, different old elites, the Vatican.
Yeah.
Right. Because I look around in the world today and I just see all these rich guys that I think are basically fronts. And frequently when they die, they don't even leave the money to their kids. Right. They leave it to promote vaccines in Africa or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And you have to sit there and say, well, okay, they got to use the money while they were alive, but now we find out that it was on loan, essentially. Any thoughts on who the Rothschilds might have been essentially fronting for?
None. No. I don't. I doubt they would. Well, there's this question.
Fronting for it may be too harsh, but I mean, working for, how's that? Being the broker for asset management.
Does Lucifer count?
Yeah. I agree, but Lucifer's got a lot of places. He's a busy guy, right? So there's Rome. There's all kinds of places.
He's got a lot of pies.
He's got a lot of places, second homes.
But the problem is that I'm not sure about this Jesuit influence. Or at least the Vatican influence. That I really can't explain. The problem is that the Vatican's long been heavily infiltrated, and like you have Leo X, who was a prime example, who was a Medici. So they're surprised that this guy was a complete scoundrel, having all kinds of mistresses and basically squandering the wealth of the church, and because the guy was an anti-Christian, and obviously a conspirator. So you have cases like that, and then you have the Jesuits themselves, who basically, Loyola seems to have been a Marrano, and if anything, even if he wasn't, his successor definitely was. So basically, the Jesuits were founded by Marranos and tended to be largely dominated by Marranos in the first few decades or centuries. So over the years, I really haven't been able to find much on the on the Jesuits, like I have on so many other participants, like the Rothschilds, like the Sabbatians, and so on and so forth. So I don't know what their role is.
The fact that you can't find anything, the hardcore conspiracy theorists will say that's because they're at the top of the pyramid. I disagree with that myself, but that's
so why. Because the thing is that the evidence, I just finished explaining this the other day actually to a proponent of this theory. The evidence for other participants is not out in the open either. You really have to dig deep to find it, but the evidence is there, right? So it's not to say, oh, well, you're finding evidence on, the Rothschilds or the Sabbatians because they're not as important, and, it's more open, which, it doesn't really make any sense because it's really not that open at all.
All right, fair enough. Can I run another question by you? It's kind of sort of a segue, but how do you think the Freemasons factor into all this? I mean, I've heard different theories regarding them. Some people say that, Freemasonry is essentially Judaism for Gentiles, right? Do you think there's any validity to that, or do you think it's something deeper? Do you think the Masons would control the Zionists, or the Zionists control the Masons, or are they just one big entity?
I think the real organization is the Rosicrucians.
Above the Zionists and the Masons?
Yeah, so the Rosicrucians basically precede them all, and the Rosicrucians were essentially responsible for founding the Freemasons, and it's very much Rosicrucian tradition, which is the underlying tradition behind the Scottish Rite Freemasonry and even Egyptian Rite Freemasonry.
Even above that, there's more elite, what are they called, chivalric orders, like the Knights of the Garter and stuff. Some people say that they're even higher than the Rosicrucians.
I don't know about that. So I mean that the Order of the Garter, that's interesting because that is important as well. But they're pretty old as well. That's a different. But they're also related to the Rosicrucians because they kind of have a Templar tradition as well, right? So really, the Rose Cross from Rosicrucian is actually the Red Cross of the Templars. So it goes back that far. And from what I try to demonstrate in my book is that this is my most important finding that I related in my recent book, was that it was the Rosicrucians who were responsible for organizing the mission of Sabbaté's V.
You have any proof from that, or can you elaborate a bit?
Yeah. So basically what happens is that Well, first of all, you have the overthrow of Charles I by Oliver Cromwell, who was funded by Manasseh ben Israel. Manasseh ben Israel, I think he was one of the leading rabbis based in Amsterdam, and have been letters that have been found where that are proof of his involvement in a conspiracy with Cromwell to overthrow Charles I. And one of the major things they were trying to accomplish was to, as we mentioned earlier, is that Jews were forbidden from most of the countries in Europe and, of course, England up until that time. So what they were trying to organize was to bring Cromwell to power, who was then going to open up the borders to the Jews, particularly people like Manasseh ben Israel, who were leaders of the important, very economically powerful Jewish community of Amsterdam. So Manasseh ben Israel was basically the head of this network of philosophers, mainly Puritan philosophers, who were responsible. They're called millenarians, millenarians. They were all responsible for building up this expectation around the year 1666. The various years were proposed, but most commonly the year 1666. And the various predictions that were supposed to take place, that the Messiah was supposed to arrive, but first the Jews had to return to England or to return to the Promised Land, and all these circumstances that involved, important changes to the conditions of the Jews so that the Messiah could arrive. So what happens is that, so you have these people like John Dury, particularly. In fact, there's what's called a Hartlib circle. So it's all the people who are associated with a Samuel Hartlib, and all these guys: Samuel Hartlib, John Dury, and Comenius. These are three guys in particular, and they're all basically associated with the Rosicrucian circles in Europe at the time. Also with the Quakers, and this is why the founding of Pennsylvania is very important, because they were also associated with the Quaker movement, which is essentially a Kabbalistic movement. So, and this is where we have also the founding of the Rosicrucian tradition in the United States by a character named Kelpius. And so all these people have associations with Sabbateans. In particular, they're connected with a guy named Peter Serrarius. And Peter Serrarius is the guy who was principally responsible for popularizing that Zavi was truly, in fact, the Messiah. Particularly, I think he was going back and forth to the Middle East, and then I hope I am getting that point right. But anyway, he was primarily responsible for, fanning this enthusiasm in particular the Amsterdam community, and especially among this circle of millenarians and Rosicrucians.
Just to sort of tie that in with what's going on today, I think the Rosicrucians sort of, in their mythology, they trace their heritage back to Damascus or something, and the unearthing of Christian Rosencrantz's tomb or something to that effect. And then you see what's going on now. It's like maybe this is somehow tied into whatever the master plan is with them trying to destabilize Syria.
Right.
That's just speculation.
According to Islamic tradition, the Antichrist is supposed to emerge from Damascus. I've heard K-Paul Johnson refer to why possibly, because you look at the modern evolution of this esoteric tradition in the Middle East that has been collaborating with intelligence organizations and the cult societies in the West was originally focused in Damascus. There's another part I talk about.
Isn't there an Islamic prediction that says the Mahdi won't come until Damascus is destroyed, or something to that effect? You could probably tell better than you'd know better than I would.
Well, it's the Antichrist himself is supposed to emerge from Damascus. The problem with the Mahdi is that this is what comes as a surprise to a lot of Muslims today, is that the Mahdi is actually not a not a tradition that's accepted by Orthodox Muslims. It's being imparted to the community largely through the influence of the Saudis, as usual, and originally through the influence of Sufism.
So is that more of a Sunni belief or Shia belief, or is it sort of both sects believe in the Mahdi?
Well, yeah. So Sunnis traditionally have not believed in the Mahdi. It's been Shia, the Shia, and then the Sufis through Shia influence. And this is why the Mahdi basically is where you find a parallel with particularly the New Age movement and so on and so forth. It's basically the Sufi tradition and their maintenance of this concept of the coming of the Mahdi, which lines up with similar expectations with Western occultists.
I think most of what I've read essentially points to the fact that the Jewish Messiah will essentially be the Christian and Muslim Antichrist, or I guess the Dajjal, maybe would be what you'd call it.
Dajjal. Yeah, something like that. But I think, he's apparently if I remember correctly, he's going to fool more than just the Jews. So we'll see.
Interesting. All right. So
why don't we move on a little bit to something that is a little bit more topical, which is the background of some of the groups we can see today, like the Muslim Brotherhood and what they might be up to.
Yeah.
We see Gaza burning or being blown up. We have, narrowly escaped Egypt going up in flames, I think. Not that any of this is safe, right? Everything may blow up next week. But what do you see in terms of some of these groups over there? First of all, do you think there's really like one Muslim Brotherhood? Or do you think that that's kind of a name used, just like Al-Qaeda is really just a name?
Definitely one Muslim Brotherhood. It's a very large and influential organization and with international tentacles. It's a society with a hierarchy and a leadership, and so with a lot of financing and very well structured. So there's no doubt about that. And I would think, most of the organizations that you see associated with terrorism or fundamentalism tend to be one way or the other linked with the Muslim Brotherhood. So like the war in Afghanistan, the CIA made use of what's called the Hizb-e-Islami, which was led by Hekmatyar, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And similarly, Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So yes, definitely. The thing is, the Islamic world right now is in utter collapse and complete disarray. So, I describe it when you have an anthill. And so the anthill is a colony which is well structured and everybody's got their roles and functions. And right now it's crushed. So everybody's running for the hills. This is what people don't recognize from the outside because the media portrays the opposite. And they try to portray a revival and try to portray organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood as being somehow symptomatic of collective sentiments, which they are not in the least. They're a very small minority, and they exist because there is a vacuum. So
are they like essentially the Freemasons of the Middle East or the Freemasons of Islam? I guess could you say that?
Well, they definitely grew out of Freemasonry. So if anything, they would be an organization like the many organizations in other countries which are fronts for Freemasonry. So I'm not sure to what extent they are a Masonic organization, but they're definitely derived from Masonic origins. So, it really goes back to the entire Rosicrucian legend. Like you mentioned, the basis of the Christian Rosenkreuz legend of him having traveled to the Middle East to learn Kabbalah and other occult arts. So this is why I say is really the Rosicrucianism is very much the founding mythology of all these actions. So, it evolved in so many ways, but Rosicrucianism evolved into the Asiatic Brethren, which I mentioned earlier, that Karl of Hessen-Kessel was the Grand Master of, which is in its his family that the Rothschilds got their start. So the Asiatic Brethren is a reference to the Brethren of Sincerity, which were an Ismaili organization that existed beginning in the 10th century in Iraq. And this is a.
Well, would you be able to talk a little bit about the Ismailis? Like, I think their spiritual leaders, the Aga Khan, right? Is that correct?
Exactly.
How does that fit into everything?
Well, it all goes back to you mentioned the Yazidis earlier, so it has to do with all these groups. So particularly, there's three groups that are kind of considered to be derived from each other, confused with each other. Either they're one or the same, or they're aspects of the same tradition. That's the Yazidis, the Mandaeans, and the Sabians of Haran. So the Sabians were actually a non-Muslim community. They chose to label themselves Sabians because, according to the Quran, there's a protected community there's various communities that are supposed to be protected called the people of the book. So they call themselves Sabians to identify with themselves with the Sabians of the Quran, but they're actually not true Sabians. They worshipped Tammuz, which is an ancient Babylonian dying god, and they practiced, most importantly, Neoplatonism and Hermeticism. So they were the group that was principally responsible for, because Neoplatonism and Hermeticism was the most important tradition of the ancient mystery schools of Hellenistic times. So what the Sabians were responsible for was transmitting those esoteric traditions into the world of Islam. The two directions that they exercised their influence was, first of all, in the founding of the Brethren of Sincerity. This was an occult-leaning organization, and they were composed mainly of Ismailis. So the Ismailis were actually a faction of the Shia sect. So the Shia sect divided into two sects themselves. One is the Seveners, and the other one is the Twelvers. So the Ismailis are basically, they are very, very far removed from true or anyway Orthodox Islamic tradition, and they're basically an occult-oriented society. So why the Aga Khan is important is because he's the hereditary leader of the Ismailis, but also the ancestor of the Old Man of the Mountain. So the Ismaili sect evolved into the Assassins. The Assassin sect, when did they emerge? They emerged in the time of the Templars. And their leader is known as the Old Man of the Mountain. They are basically a terrorist group headed by these Hassani Sabah, known as the Old Man of the Mountain, who apparently used hashish to indoctrinate his recruits. And this is why in Islamic history they're known as hashishim, which means eaters of hashish. So the legend is that the Templars, when they were in the Holy Land during the Crusades, they came into contact with a group of quote-unquote Eastern mystics. So these Eastern mystics can be identified with either of these traditions because they're all rooted in the same origin, which is basically the Sabians. So these mystics basically were Ismaili assassins, Brethren of Sincerity, and so on and so forth. And what the legend is that the Templars then rescued, or quote-unquote rescued, a number of these Eastern mystics and brought them to Scotland. And that is supposedly the origin of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. So this is the Rosicrucian legend. It's Rosicrucian tradition, which is responsible for maintaining this tradition and introducing it into Freemasonry, where it evolved into Scottish Rite Freemasonry. So this is where we get the base. This is where you get the basis of this entire mythos of the survival of an esoteric tradition in Egypt. So when Christian Rosenkreutz goes to the Holy Land, this is what he's supposedly coming in contact with. But also, there were numerous important Kabbalistic communities in the Middle East at the time, particularly in Kairouan, and where would that be? In North Africa, and of course Egypt, and then again in Palestine. Another person which is important in this story is Jacob Berman, who his mentor was Balthazar Walter. And Balthazar Walter had traveled to Palestine to study under the disciples of Isaac Luria. So all this stuff is all the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria. The Kabbalah of Isaac Luria basically infiltrated into Rosicrucianism through Jacob Berman. And the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria is the clash of civilizations. So what is happening right now, the struggle in the Middle East, what's being fabricated, this dialectic between Zionism and Islamic fundamentalism, is a play of the Kabbalistic dialectic, which goes all the way back to Isaac Luria.
It's quite a tangled web of names and societies, and
yeah,
it's like a giant octopus, right? And he is tracing it back is hard.
It's complicated for the first time, but once you start to understand the pattern, it gets more and more simple to understand. It's just, it's like communicated the first time, it sounds new, but this is fundamentally what it's all about, right? So the Rosicrucians are the true underlying leaders who have maintained this mythology of an Egyptian contact with an Egyptian tradition, esoteric tradition.
Just as a side note, I think recently I read or I've seen a video or something that I think the Queen of England basically gave the Aga Khan his title, or gave him some type of title that he essentially swore allegiance to the Queen, right?
Yeah. There's some very bizarre associations going on. I mean, the Aga Khan, his grandfather was one of the first leaders of the League of Nations, and this is a king without a kingdom, right? They don't have a country, but somehow all his community. I think they're required to pay up to something like 10% of their income or something, exorbitant like that. And this is how he lives lavishly like a monarch from, the alms contributed to him through the years, and then has all these highfalutin associations with royalty and leaders around the world. So, it's very suspicious, but I think if we know the occult history, we can kind of begin to understand what the heck is probably going on there. Basically, he's the successor of the old man of the mountain.
Well, where to go from here?
Well, I could explain the background of the clash of civilizations then, if you would bring us back.
Yeah, we can probably get to the more modern stuff with the clash of civilizations. I think that how can we put it? That's what we're looking at is this attempt to gin up a war and a Cold War and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Whether they'll succeed or not, I don't know. What do you think of getting to the more modern thing? Because I see, you can just see it, setting aside religious stuff or spiritual stuff, you can just see that it's geopolitics. I mean, the Anglo-American control of the planet, what it's based on, and then the rise of the alternatives to that. Right? I mean, in other words, it's just convenient for them to have this grand struggle in the Middle East or whatever, or struggle with Russia.
Yeah.
But that's, if you were in their shoes and you were a declining empire, that's what you'd want to do. You know what I mean? In other words, you don't need a religious explanation, I think, is what some are going to argue.
No. For whose participation do you mean? For the Russians or for?
No. For the Anglo-Americans. They're in decline, obviously, around the world.
Maybe.
And I think in terms of economics and such, you can see, or just population, the rise of Asia. I live here in Asia, and you can see. I mean, come on, China looks more modern than the U.S., or Canada, I mean, and if you counted the GDP in a normal way, and you didn't add derivatives, instead you subtracted them. Yeah. Right, China would already have a much bigger economy than the U.S. or something.
Right.
So you can see why those in charge of places like the U.S. or Britain would be kind of panicked. They'd say, "We got to blow things up now before And indeed, the Wolfowitz doctrine is basically that, is that we have to prevent the rise of any potential challengers or alliance of challengers. And so what that means is you have to create failed states everywhere. You have to blow everybody up.
Yeah.
And if you look over the last 20 years, that's what the U.S. has done. It hasn't installed pro-Western dictators. It's just destroyed everything. Somalia, Libya, you name it, right? Yeah. So anyway, let's get to the clash of civilizations. Yeah, sorry, Jerry?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that's one side of it, but there's definitely, it seems like they're trying to build the narrative or paint the narrative. They're trying to sort of make these prophecies come to fruition, right? Now, that having been said, do you think these people actually believe these prophecies, David, or do you think that they're just trying to sort of manifest them because, the hoi polloi will believe in them?
No, you know what? That's a very good question, because I actually believe that they're deliberately trying to fulfill the book of Revelations. Not because they believe it's a Christian book, but because they know it's a Kabbalistic book.
That's interesting. Okay, yeah. So you think that the higher ups actually believe it then?
I think almost with a very high degree of certainty. I think this is why you get things like RFID chips and stuff like that. People think like, oh my gosh, that seems to be fulfilling the prophecy of the book of Revelation. But the fact is, it's like, well, yeah, because the book of Revelation is the blueprint.
And one other thing, just kind of another segue, and I don't want to get too far off topic here, but in regards to the year 1666, from some of the stuff I've read, the number 666 in the Kabbalah is actually, from their perspective, is sort of a holy number attributed to the Messiah, whereas in the Christian readings, I don't know about the Muslim, but in the Christian readings, it's called the number of the beast, right?
Absolutely. So yeah, the reason why all those millenarians like John Dewey and Samuel Hartlip and all those guys, they picked that number specifically because of mystical significance as they understood it. So yes, I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing, obviously, because everybody knows the significance of 666 and that they could pick that number and then work to promote it, without people raising their eyebrows.
And I think even the UPC barcode, I think, is based on the number 666 too. So, I mean, you're right. I mean, from my perspective, none of this stuff is coincidence. They obviously either they're doing it intentionally, but again, it goes back to, were they doing it because they believed it, or were they doing it because they thought we believed it? But
or hey, right. Jerry, there's the other angle. The first Apple computer cost $666.
Yeah,
right.
That
was good. That was great marketing. I mean, it's an Apple with a bite out of it, and it costs $666.
Yeah. This is something I've been researching recently, which is the history of transhumanism. You see, this is what's interesting, is that transhumanism is Rosicrucianism, and where it's evolving now is, I wrote a review about the movie Lucy, which is basically transhumanism. This is exactly everything they've been working for. So this all goes back to cybernetics, the Frankfurt School, and their long-standing plan for the last 60 years or so has been development of the computer towards creating a global mind, which is basically the god of Luria's Kabbalah. This is a direct consequence of Isaac Luria's Kabbalah. This is why Rosicrucianism is linked to it, because this is the purpose.
I just saw that movie this week, so yeah, and believe it or not, I did see quite a bit of Luciferian symbolism in it as well.
Yeah, because this is what they're aiming for, right? According to Isaac Luria, that history is the evolution of mankind becoming God. So the Antichrist is going to be Nietzsche's Superman. It's going to be the first man who is going to, supposedly know or recognize that he is God, and he's going to be worshipped as such. But more recently, the way it's being evolved, and this is where we have an important Jesuit influence, which is his name is a Jesuit priest named Teilhard de Chardin, and he is the most influential figure of the, if you can believe it, New Age movement. But he's also recognized as the patron saint of the internet. because they're all working on this idea of what they call a noosphere. They believe that and this is what Dan Brown talks about in The Lost Symbol, and on and on and on. They believe that humanity will evolve and produce a sort of collective global consciousness, that we will create a collective mind. And they believe that the creation of the internet will be the creation of this collective mind. In other words, that the internet, it sounds ridiculous, or the computer will be the way that humanity will achieve godhood. And this is what all these guys like Ray Kurzweil and people like that, and this is essentially the significance of the Lucy movie, that in the end, how does she finish it? He asks her, "Where are you?" And she says, "I'm everywhere." Right? This is what they all imagine, is that they're going to be able to export their personalities into cyberspace and then live forever. And then cyberspace is going to be the collection of all the knowledge accumulated in history. So essentially, they're going to be omniscient and essentially become God.
That sort of reminds me of some of the stuff I've read about Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy movement.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but essentially he kind of sees history as a battle between the Ahrimanic path, which is man sort of striving to merge with machine, versus the Luciferian path, which is man sort of working on his spiritual powers. And he basically sees this conflict back and forth between the two.
Well, see, he's another important influence behind the rise of the computer as well. So when you read the books of the transhumanists, they basically what's the recent one? There's one guy he's a Dutch Bostrom, I think is what his name is. There's two sort of recognized leaders of the transhumanist movement right now. There's David Pierce and this other guy, his last name is Bostrom. And so he's written a history of transhumanism, and it's basically a history of Rosicrucianism. It's basically saying that transhumanism and the computer, the evolution of the computer, is rooted in the history of alchemy and tracing it back to Francis Bacon and so on and so forth. So,
yeah, I mean, you can definitely see the influences of the Kabbalists for sure, and gematria and all that, and the computer and the binary code and all that. So yeah, definitely. Yeah. It sounds like that might be a good topic for your next book, David.
Well, I'm partly through it already. Yeah.
Oh, is that what your goal is?
Working on, yeah.
Awesome. All right. Did we want to get back into the sort of long segue there? But did we want to get back into the clash of civilizations?
Yeah, sure. Because that comes to the Cabal of Isaac Luria again, which is the idea that man is becoming God. So this is basically what they're aiming to achieve. So, I mean, the clash of civilization. To go back to it, basically, if history is the history of man evolving towards becoming God. So in any way, essentially in the beginning, he worshipped things or ideas outside of himself. So he worshipped stones and rocks and streams and spirits, and eventually came up with the idea of a God outside of himself. But then the Greeks were the first to sort of, supposedly, this is a Hegelian interpretation of history, the history of Western civilization, which is mythology. The Greeks were supposedly the first to question the whole idea of religion as a whole. So the Greeks were the beginning of secularism. So, paradoxically, the Kabbalistic interpretation of history is a secular one. It regards evolution as man progressively abandoning the idea of any kind of divinity outside of himself and slowly evolving towards the recognition that he is God. So this is why the Greeks are basically, considered as the first to incept the idea, and then most importantly, the Renaissance, which was basically entirely an occult movement, and then most importantly, the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was the first period that suggested that we no longer need revelation, we no longer need scriptures, we can rely entirely on reason. And this is very much the basis of the clash of civilizations, the entire mythology of the West, which they are trying to push forward to substantiate their program. So, well, what you have at this time is you have all these philosophers and thinkers who started to develop this idea that, if we don't need scripture anymore, we can figure out rules for ourselves. We don't need recourse for a Bible. We can figure out how to govern ourselves according to the use of our own reason. So you get people like Hobbes and Locke and so on and so forth. And then this is how you get the idea of liberty and rights. And this is the basis of the American adoption of these ideas. And, this is why the United States was really fundamentally the first successful Illuminati project, an Enlightenment project, because it was the first successful establishment of a secular state. And they did the same thing in France. So the mythology they continue to create is that human progress is marked by an advancement towards ever more secularism and basically atheism, or what they call humanism. So what we've arrived at is over 2,000 years of this Lurianic evolution, where we're progressing more towards God. We've arrived at secular democracy. So the West represents secular democracy, and we could sort of, march forward to our final stage of evolution, and for the victory or the apotheosis of humanity, except that we are being held back by these medievalists, people in other parts of the world, particularly the Islamic world, or this is the way it's presented, who are holding on to the idea of theocracy. Basically what they're trying to say, an archaic, anachronistic idea that it's possible to marry religion and politics. So this is basically the dialectic. This is the Hegelian dialectic, which they have been working very hard to manufacture over recent times. As I mentioned earlier, though, the Islamic world is in complete disarray. It's incapable of mobilizing any kind of opposition. So the only way to manufacture an opposition from the Islamic world would be to cultivate it themselves. So this is how they began, by creating the Wahhabi movement, first of all, but then most importantly, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in the 1920s. So this is largely what they have been playing with, particularly since the early 90s. With the first, it was Bernard Lewis, who wrote he was the first one who wrote about the Clash of Civilizations. That was then adopted by Samuel Huntington, who developed Francis Fukuyama's thesis. And Francis Fukuyama, he's the one who wrote, a neoconservative, who wrote The End of History. And that brings in a whole lot of other traditions we talked about the other time. So this is the Clash of Civilizations. This is the dialectic. Basically, dialectic is to play two opposing theses, and to have them resolved into a synthesis. This is the Kabbalistic idea of opposing dualities to produce a resolution of dualities into a synthesis.
So what is the synthesis going to be, David? Any thoughts?
That's I don't know. That's a tough question. Like I say, I think what's happening right now is actually a playing out of Pike's World War III scenario. If we're actually going to go through an actual World War III or just preliminary stage of it, I have no idea. What the solution is, how it's going to play out, I really don't know. But I guess somehow, this is why I think what's happening now is that we're going to see growing opposition to the state of Israel, because I think that they're finally opening the floodgates on it now, where that kind of opposition is being tolerated, and because I think they want to build it up. And I think this is part of the struggle that they want to fabricate by really polarizing the issue. And now it seems paradoxical that a Zionist Illuminati is going to be using Zionism as its one of its camps. But so I'm not sure how it's going to play out exactly, or how these oppositions are going to be played against each other. But I guess one way or the other, the idea is to create a new world order. So,
well, I mean, I definitely see, a lot of, like, you'd call it anti-Semitism, or maybe that's not a great word. I actually don't like that word, but in any event,
there's an anti-Israel sentiment is
that's
very
the
large
problem,
around
right?
the world.
And this is how it gets played, right? We have to understand the difference of confusing. It's like I say, it's like talking about the Jewish mafia and then blaming every Italian. Sorry, not the Jewish mafia, the Italian mafia, and blaming every Italian. Right? The guy who owns the Italian restaurant is not necessarily part of the mafia. It's the same thing with the Jews. It's the blaming the people as a whole, which is the tool. That's what anti-Semitism is. And the problem is that I think everybody needs to clearly learn how to distinguish between the crimes of some Jews and the crimes of and the people as a whole, because it's the blame of the people as a whole, which is the strategy that they use. The strategy both that they use to create the anti-Semitism that's necessary as a controlled opposition, but also to label anybody who expresses legitimate criticism against the few. So I think this is always important why we try to steer away from those kinds of generalizations.
Yeah, but it's difficult when, you see on the news, not in the mainstream news, of course, but in the alternative media, Jewish towns going up on the hill with lawn chairs and beer and kind of cheering on the slaughter of civilians in Gaza, right? I mean, when you look, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's being disseminated intentionally, again, to foment the schism.
Because then we could do the same thing for Muslims, right? I mean, it's all Muslims carrying out most of the acts of terror. Or are you going to assume that all Muslims are idiots? All Muslims are Al-Qaeda or supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. Support for Al-Qaeda has been dwindling. It was only down to like 15%. Just how many 4 or 5 years ago? I don't know. I probably completely disappeared now. So the Jewish community is, it's a collection of individuals. We have to be careful not to blame the entire community for the action. And in fact,
hey, David,
this is what their leaders want.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
If we're going to talk about blaming individuals, did you read Fire in the Minds of Men, Billington's work?
You know what? I read some of it, but I haven't. I'm not too familiar with it.
Okay, because some consider it like the definitive Western, book on the Illuminati. It's the, and you could argue that he essentially is one of them, right? That he's sympathetic to them.
Okay.
And it's a very, very scholarly work. I mean, you need to, be able to navigate different languages and historical things. But his take is the what he would call the revolutionary tradition. So that would be the French Revolution, the American Revolution, all of these basically Illuminist kind of projects came from Central Europe, and in particular from Germany or German-speaking countries.
Yeah.
And they came out of the secret societies.
Yeah.
And, we can debate this, right? But in other words, he's arguing the French Revolution came out of German-speaking lands. It didn't come from Germany. It didn't come from France.
No, sure.
And if that's the case, okay, but so what? We can't blame all German speakers for the excesses of the French Revolution. I mean, they're just people, and these secret societies and rich people, and indeed, even if they're in Germany, they might have been 40% Jewish or something. You know what I mean? You just can't blame individuals for the actions of the elite who are in these strange groups and religious practices and whatever. But I think getting to the clash of civilizations, though, I mean, I see, setting aside the whole religious side, I just see that, to me, it looks like the West is sinking, falling apart. And maybe I'm wrong, but I see a kind of panic, at least in the visible layer, not in the Rosicrucians, but in politics and business circles.
Yeah.
And so, there are all these plans, but there's that quote from Mike Tyson that everybody's got a plan until you punch him in the face.
Yeah.
Right? You know what I'm saying? In other words, I don't question that the neocons have plans. They got 100 plans, but on the other hand, okay, but every year China's economy is a hell of a lot bigger. Okay,
Yeah,
so
but
what's your
isn't China's economy that much bigger because of collusion with the West? I mean, wasn't it Clinton's, numerous deals that we were signing with the Chinese that opened up, China's economy? Isn't it all the manufacturing from numerous American corporations in China, which is bringing it about?
Good
Apple,
point.
Walmart.
Oh, I totally agree with that, but that still begs the question of, okay, there's been collusion,
Yeah,
right? No question. But now they have their internal market, just like the United States got developed up eventually, right?
yeah,
The first X number of years, it was totally dependent on Europe, right? But then at some point, it became its own powerhouse, right?
yeah,
And I think that's happened in Asia now.
yeah.
And so I think we're now at the point where they don't need, let's say, the North American market to prosper. And in other words, China needs Southeast Asia more than it needs the U.S. now, I think, from a future point of view.
Maybe.
But we can debate, when that point would occur. Is that point, a year ago, or is that 10 years from now? But nonetheless, I would just argue that I don't think these guys are all supreme. I mean, they make their plans, but in the end, God makes his plans or something.
Absolutely. But I think this comes down to, if I can express a religious idea,
Sure.
and I'll mention a Christian one in particular because that's where it's most well expressed. But I believe that that's the fundamental belief of Islam as well, and it really comes down to what Jesus said: love your neighbor, and he even said, love your enemy. Right. So
Yeah.
the problem, I think, I think that the solution is, when people think that the truth has been suppressed, but they confuse information with the truth. There's all kinds of, like, all the stuff that I expose in my books, it's mainly information. It's not really the truth, because the true truth that has been suppressed is a moral truth. And the moral truth is just that. It's love your neighbor. Because, humans are complicated.
Yes.
And the thing is that, Illuminati they do evil, but they're not necessarily evil. They're complex people. Some of them, are kind to their kids. They might give a little charity sincerely. Who knows what, right? But the fact is that, there's nobody or any entity which is evil. There's no force of evil. So when it comes to Illuminati, we have to despise what they do, but we have to be careful of despising them. It's, in a sense, only God is the judge, and only God knows who's going to heaven or hell, how he's going to judge every human being. So our responsibility is only to take care of the evident, but it's not our place to judge anybody. And it's really none of our concern. So we don't need to identify who's bad or who's good, because it's not about that. It might even be our own relative. It's if it's somebody doing wrong, then it's the wrong that has to be stopped. So it's, in a sense, I don't know. I hope that's making some sense, but I think this is really ultimately the truth that come down to. It's not about blaming anybody. We need to be careful of avoiding that kind of judgment in our hearts for anybody, no matter how apparently evil the actions are that they are responsible for. We only address their actions, and when it comes down to Illuminati, I just think that it's complex. There's all kinds of people in there with different levels of commitment and different different issues at stake and so on and so forth, that maybe some people are just so wrapped in they don't know what to do to get out, or some people are constantly selfish, some people are taking advantage of it. So I don't think there's really a unified approach to involvement in it, and that's really none of our concern.
I think most of the people in there probably think that they're doing good, right? Again, whether they are or not, or I don't know.
I doubt it. I doubt it because I think that, a human being is born with an inherent sense of right and wrong. And the only way you can do wrong is to convince yourself that it's good. But somewhere deep down, you're lying to yourself. And
Yeah, I agree.
this is the, this is the human being's, exit clause, right? But basically, anybody who does wrong needs to repent. Like we're all fundamentally have the same potential for good. No one's fundamentally evil. They've made an inherent choice.
I mean,
well, I say, can we get back to the Clash of Civilization a little bit more, if you don't mind? I'm kind of curious what you see as happening going forward. Do you think they actually will manage to get a big war?
I really don't know. I really, I mean, it's impossible. 9/11 caught me just completely by surprise. I couldn't have even predicted that, or, I had no idea. So things happen all the time that I have no idea what to expect. I just do my best to try to understand what their plans are in general, from what they've revealed here and there in one way or the other. But how it's going to play out, I think I don't even think it's necessary to try to see unless there's something concrete that you can identify. Because so many things could happen anytime. I think in general we see in one way or the other, it is World War III, just on a different level of intensity, right?
Yeah, I would argue that too.
It just depends on to what extent they want to escalate it.
Well, if they don't get the big war, it's certainly not from lack of trying.
Yeah, well, I think if they're ready for it, they could definitely make it happen.
Well, I mean, it seems, again, who knows what's going to play out, but, when you look at what's going on in the Ukraine, and it really looks like they're trying to antagonize Russia, and it really looks like they want them to give them an excuse to start something.
But, I just remember pictures of Putin going fishing with the Bushes in Kennebunk, and I really can't believe that he's real opposition. I just think that it's got to be a stage managed performance somehow.
You think it's like the Jesse Ventura quote? It's a wrestling match where you have the good guys and the bad guys, and then at the end of the match, they go behind in the dressing room and have beers together, right?
Exactly, something like that. To tell you the truth, when I saw the juxtaposition last week of what I saw of Lucy, I think in the same day I saw Lucy, and I listened to the speech of the leader of the ISIS, who supposedly declared himself caliph.
Right.
And for me, the juxtaposition of those two instances really signaled something very important. It's just that Lucy is the loudest, most vocal expression of that transhumanist message. It's really trying to alert the world as to, like, we're on the cusp of what these guys think they are going to accomplish. There's this idea. It's like they think that we're on the cusp of this great, bright future, the singularity, they call it, like this new stage of evolution. That's why Lucy is like this new Eve, the first transhuman. It's so much the expression of of everything that's perceived as the latest of 2,000 years of intellectual and technological evolution. And then on the other hand, you got this nitwit in the Middle East who all of a sudden has got a force which straddles a border and extends into two countries, completely disrupting borders that have existed intact for 80 years. And this guy from, he's wearing a turban and talking all kinds of nonsense like he just leapt out of the 12th century. You know what I mean? So it's like the fact that these two pronouncements would be almost simultaneous, to me somehow signals that something's in the works, because those are both the simultaneous expressions of the dualities that they've been trying to work towards. One is singularity, and the other one is the Islamic threat and this medieval Islamic threat.
Well, I mean, a lot of people, conspiracy theorists primarily, but they say that, you know, the elite or the Illuminati either like to tell us what they're going to do, but I would say that that's more of sort of like a karmic obligation from their perspective. It's almost like they put us on legal notice. So when they release a movie like Lucy with all this Luciferian symbolism, it's almost like they're sort of putting us on legal notice of what's going on, right?
Yeah, I think so. Because there's been quite a slew of these movies, right? There's been Transcendence and Her, and those are only in recent versions. There's also The Matrix, and of course, Total Recall, RoboCop, you know, Blade Runner, on and on and on. So they've been at it for a while, but it seems they've been kind of increasing to a crescendo these days.
Well, yeah, for sure, all these things are going on, but I still think that we could argue that these guys are crazy too.
Oh yeah,
you know, they've lost the plot, and I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, maybe some emperor in China 1800 years ago, or some leader in the Mughal Empire or whatever, some of these guys thought they were going to dominate the world with their New World Order too.
Yeah.
And there's that song, that traditional song, "Sooner or Later, God's going to cut you down."
Right.
And, you know, in Europe, there have been 2 or 3 previous attempts at a New World Order that totally collapsed. The Venetian financiers, you know, and when they collapse, then, you know, a lot of people die. It's a very ugly thing, but, you know, it's possible that that's what's going to happen. It's not necessarily that, I don't know what to say, there's going to be this global dictatorship of, you know, the Rothschilds. Maybe instead it's just going to all collapse in like the Tower of Babel or something.
Well, that's the thing. I think you can never really know, right? It's not even worth trying to predict it. But I think I think this attempt is unique, though, and I think that they recognize it as unique as well, because I think they consciously attempted to achieve world domination in a way unlike every other attempt in the past. That most attempts in the past were overt, and they recognized that those attempts failed, so that they were going to try to achieve it covertly. So I think that's why this is unique and why it's really quite successful, and really the first probably attempt of like it to come that close to actual world domination. Like, it's, you know, this might not be the one to succeed. Maybe it will fail, and another, you know, there'll be another attempt later. But I think they have succeeded, you know, substantially. And if this does play out to be an attempt to install the Antichrist as the, you know, king of the New World Order, then I think that's where the significance lies.
Well, clearly they're trying, and they have felt that they're on the cusp of this, and they've been pushing it, and at least some of them have, and so there's no question about that. I think there was that quote from, was it a Warburg in front of the U.S. Congress in the early 1950s, along the lines of, "We're going to have a world government. The only question is whether it will be by consent or conquest."
Exactly. And I think that's because they appreciate the tact that they've adopted. You know, they recognize that it's comprehensive and very difficult to identify and suppress.
Well, David, I'll just remind you, though, that quote was in D.C., and I'm originally from D.C., and at that time, the U.S. dominated the planet in every imaginable way, technologically, economically, industrial capability, you name it, right? And so when you're sitting in the capital of a place that has 50% of everything that matters on the planet, right, it's easy to say that.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm not sure, you know, can they say it today?
Yeah, but that's probably part of the plan, Paul, because if you want to have this New World Order, you can't have a powerful United States, that could essentially unbalance it, right? You've got to have the great leveling. Everything's got to be equal.
And do they really care where it's headquartered from? They could easily move to Russia or China, Thailand.
Well, that is the big question. The big question is, are they so motivated that it doesn't even matter if it's a white man's empire?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Right? If they get a global government, but it's run from China, would they be happy?
Sure, why not?
And that's a big question. I can say that at the lower levels, no. The answer is, let's say, a neocon is not going to be happy if China runs the world. No, because they're addicted to power, right? You can see it in their, you know what I mean? They don't want to give up the power. But at the more esoteric level, like you're talking about Rosicrucians or something,
yeah,
then that's a different matter.
Well,
they're at a different kind of level. I think their motivations are different.
I think we just have to identify what's the real sources of their financial power right now, though. And I don't know what the answer is, but to look more closely at what the financial power is in Asia and what links, if any, they have with the Western financial powers. And I would suspect that they're very closely aligned in some way.
Oh, I'm sure they are, but I just think that if you deal with China, spend time in China, I think that a lot of the world feels it's been dominated by the white man for a long time, and they are very much looking forward to that ending as soon as possible. And maybe I'm wrong, but I can see them having an alliance of interests. But push comes to shove, there's only one boss, right? And I think we see the struggles right now. Earlier we were talking about the struggles with Russia, but the struggles with China are also very obvious. The terrorism inside China has got Langley written all over it.
Right, absolutely.
And
it's the old great game.
It's the great game. And Central Asia, which we talked about in our last interview, is a similar story. It's got Langley written all over it. And that threatens not only Russia, but it threatens China too, because that's their economic lifeline. Yeah. And so, well, anyway, the answer is we can't know. We just don't know how this is going to play out. But I think it's easy to imagine a more globalized world, but there are different visions of it. There's Putin's vision of like a more integrated world, but each country can do what it wants, like his Eurasian alliance. Yeah. And then there's the New World Order that we think of in the West. I'm sorry?
Which is a CIA plot.
What, the Eurasian alliance?
Yeah.
How so? How would that be a CIA plot?
Well,
I would say that we're trying to break up the Eurasian alliance. We try to blow it up in every way we can.
Yeah, but there's the Eurasian movement, which is headed by Alexander Dugin.
Right, of course.
And who interestingly has deep ties with the KGB and so on and so forth. And this is a significant portion of my book, actually. And because going back to the whole idea of the great game, which is what I follow for, pretty much how it played out last 150 years. Particularly, we talked about Shambhala and so on and so forth, because that's what it's all connected to. And what's amazing is that throughout that whole period, there's always double agents and triple agents involved, and it's really hard to tell who's actually pulling the string and who's fighting who. So when you get a guy like Alexander Dugin and his connections, Alexander Dugin is basically the leading exponent of what's called traditionalism, and he's got some interesting Islamic connections as well too, and so it's part of this extended fascist network, an international fascist network that is founded through the tradition of traditionalism. So Julius Evola was an exponent. Dugin is supposed to be secretly the leader of the Gladio version, the Turkish Gladio called Ergenekon. And there's so many tangents to follow there. It's hard to keep it simple. But basically, we talked about this last time that the CIA and NATO created all these Gladio networks across Europe, which were stay-behind units of fascist thugs that we're supposed to use as a resistance forces in case of a Russian occupation.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a number of them. There's Gladio in Italy, and there's various versions in other countries. And in Turkey, is called Ergenekon. So Dugin has connections to them. And Ergenekon is actually the name of the Turkish name for Agartha. And Agartha is the Hollow Earth. It's the name for what's called the Hollow Earth, which is known to or basically believed in by the Synarchist tradition. And so basically the modern Turkish Ergenekon network, which is basically a terrorist organization inside of Turkey, which is responsible, basically, what do they call it, like a deep state. And they, like I said, they name themselves after Agartha, which they connect with the original homeland of the Turks. And this is a pan-Turkist mythology, which has its origin in the Domine, who are the Turkish Sabbatians. So that's where these things come back around. So that's how Dugin is connected with that. And the CIA has been basically using this idea of a neo-caliphate, which is to create a new caliphate based out of Turkey, a neo-Ottoman caliphate, which is supposed to unite the Turkish peoples of Central Asia under the leadership of this neo-Ottoman caliphate. And this is basically the strategy that they've been used to rally the Islamic fundamentalists in East Turkestan against China, which is basically, as I said, a CIA strategy. And they've been using this has been through connections with Ergenekon, to which Dugin is connected with.
Well, David, Dugin is connected to everybody because he's kind of like, what can we say it? He's the touchstone of I don't know how to put it. Let's say radical things. Okay, radical right, radical left, radical traditionalism, radical anti-British City of London stuff.
Yeah.
So having a connection with Dugin means you're interested in politics in some sense. But the Eurasian idea is a different. There's the specifics of what you're talking about, like this group or that group is up to something, right?
Yeah.
And that's going to be full of the usual spies, economic opportunists, everything, and they come and go. But the bigger idea, really, though, is just like I don't know what you're going to say. It's just an economic trade zone to try to be able to withstand the onslaught of the EU and the US.
Yeah, sure. That's the way they make it out to be.
And I mean, if you were in those countries like Kazakhstan, the biggest guy for the Eurasian Alliance forever has been Nazarbayev, the head of Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
It hasn't been, let's say Dugin or somebody like that. I think it's from his point of view, if you're stuck in Central Asia, if you don't do more business with China and Russia, then you're going to be third world forever, right?
I just don't really trust these apparent oppositions. I just don't really believe that, there's actually a real struggle between Russia and, Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution was financed by Wall Street, so, and as I understand,
and run with German intelligence.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I think it really comes down to that. I had a great talk with somebody, Elad Pressman, a few weeks or months ago, and he really impressed me with the idea that the fundamental belief of the Kabbalah is this resolution of opposites. And this is why all their activities consciously manufacture opposites. And this is how they participate in this WDF struggle, as you said, of playing roles. So I don't really take as very sincere these kinds of, anti-NATO stances or anti-West or even Putin's pronouncements. I think he's playing into people's hands, or he's whatever, he's playing the game.
But David,
yeah.
David, I'm not exactly disagreeing with you. I'm trying to say that there can be different positions or interests. Like, for example, Daniel Estulin is famous as being a researcher on the Bilderberg Group, right? Yeah. And he says in the last meeting they've had their, most bitter fights in 15 or 20 years. And the fight is very simple.
Yeah.
Is the Russian elite, like Putin, have been trying to become friends with the Central European elite, and to the extent possible, the Western European elite, right? And present their version of what you might want to call a new world order, right? But whatever you want to call it, a globalized future, right?
Yeah.
And then that's in total contrast to the American City of London dominated version of a new world order, right? In other words, they can have different visions, competing interests is all I'm saying. That doesn't mean that the Russian elite are good guys. Do you understand? Well, I'm just trying to, that they can have a different view of the kind of future they want to see. That's all.
Yeah, but we don't know what role those representatives at Bilderberg play, or how powerful they are, to what extent they can have a say. Maybe they are talking big, but they don't realize that they're not as powerful as they think, or maybe to what extent are Bilderberg conferences an actual reflection of the true power behind the scenes? I don't know.
Well, the answer is we don't know that. It's above our pay grade. It's above our pay grade. I'm just trying to say that I think we can see. It's not exactly a disagreement. There's this use of conflict to drive things in certain directions. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that some of the players know that, including probably Putin. They realize that this is all part of a contrived, conflict of civilizations, that kind of thing. Well, I tell you what, David, we're going to wrap it up soon. Are there any other things you've been working on, or you want to let the audience know about, books that you're going to have come out, or anything?
Not really. I mean, my last book was pretty comprehensive, so I'd like to invite anybody to read that, because it covers everything we've said, but a lot more detail. There's so many traditions that are really crucial to understanding what's really going on. We talked about the Rosicrucian tradition, but also Synarchism, which is really key. Even the ideas of Shambhala and its role in playing up the myth of Central Asia, which leads into ideas about shamanism and MK Ultra, which then in turn is connected with transhumanism, as we talked about, the birth of the computer, and so on and so forth. So, I invite people to read my book, Black Terror, White Soldiers, Islam, Fascism, and New Age, which is where I've covered all that stuff, and I'm currently, hopefully, working on the next stage, an evolution from what I covered in that book, discussing issues of transhumanism. And most of these things I discuss on my website, which is terrorism-illuminati.com, and also my Facebook page, which is where I post quite a few things, my articles, and as well as news I find on the web, and also my Twitter feed.
Okay. Sounds very good. We appreciate it. Yeah, I guess wrapping it up, I don't have much to say in closing, other than looking at your website and listening to some of your interviews. It's fascinating material. I mean, it's just the depth, the historical depth of this is really quite impressive. So I really recommend that people follow your work. Okay, I guess we'll call it a wrap then, David. We appreciate you coming.
Dave, thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
Thanks a lot, David.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're doing good work. We really appreciate it. Okay, Thanks. That's it, folks. Till next time. Bye-bye.